This is Democracy,
a podcast about the people of the United States.
A podcast about citizenship,
about engaging with politics and the world around you.
A podcast about educating yourself on today's important issues
and how to have a voice in what happens next.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. This week, we're going to discuss an issue that has been very much in the news and in our personal experiences here in Texas, and a topic that has been with us for quite a long time as well. How should the United States, how should communities, and how should Texas in particular manage energy? What kind of energy policy should we have? And how should our society distribute power and manage the use of energy in different forms in different places throughout our country and our democracy? We have with us a good friend, one of the leading scholars on the topic, and also one of the leading academic thinkers and program leaders on this topic, Professor Varun Rai. Good morning, Varun.
Good morning, Jeremy. Thank you so much.
It's delightful to have you here. Always fun to work with you. Dr. Varun Rai is the Walt and Elspeth Rostow Professor in the LBJ School of Public Affairs, where I have the great pleasure of working with him at the University of Texas at Austin. He's a wonderful colleague. He's the director of the university's Energy Institute, which is a university-wide and really an international center for major research on this topic. He's also the Associate Dean for Research at the LBJ School. Varun does remarkably interdisciplinary and rigorous work spanning multiple disciplines, delving into issues of energy systems, complex systems, decision science, and public policy. He has briefed the U.S. Senate and many other government agencies. His work has been showcased in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Bloomberg News, and many other locations. He's also a major policy influencer through organizations like the commission that oversees Austin Energy here in Austin, Texas. And one other thing I should mention is that his work has been honored by the David and Kershaw Award and Prize, which is really a big deal, from the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management. He received an honor as one of the leading scholars under the age of 40 in this field. So it's really a treat to have Varun with us to help explain these issues and help us think about how we go forward as a democracy in the world of energy that we're living with today. Before we turn to that topic with Varun, of course, we have Zachary's scene-setting poem. What's the title of your poem today, Zachary?
Do not be alone when the lights come back on.
Okay, it sounds interesting, Zachary. Let's hear it.
The heat is transferred from the glass to the water in the chemistry diagram I read by candlelight. The wind gyrates the tree branches, broken beneath are the streetlights, as if windmills out there in the dimness. Let loose your imaginings of a modern sensibility. Put away the image of your neighborhood by light, and watch it sink like the end of a flash bulb into the hills, shrouded deep in the darkness. And don't forget that when you awake, the world will be white, bright and gleaming as if you had never slept. The cold sucks the water into icicles outside. One hangs in the corner of the roof, dangling above the gate, reminding me tauntingly how wonderful it will be to see it fall. Forget that you can even picture living in the glow of phosphorescent bulbs, that the street lamps once worked or at least flickered into something you could understand. And remember now that when the lights are inevitably on again, the digital clock face will make you jump, scare you senseless. Do not be alone when the lights come back on. Do not be alone when the lights come back on. It is perhaps more of a wish than a warning. Do not be alone when the lights come back on. Maybe if you repeat this too many times, you will feel the lights again with my head already in your hands. Do not be alone when the lights come back on. It will be jarring, maybe dangerous, maybe haunting, maybe even electrifying.
Zachary, that poem makes me in many ways relive what we experienced just a few weeks ago with the loss of power here in Texas. Zachary, what is your poem about?
My poem is really about the very strange moment we found ourselves here in Texas in just a few weeks ago, when we were constantly being reminded of how modern our world was, and yet we felt so dependent on such primitive factors as weather or disease, and I think it's a very strange reminder in our modern world.
That's very well said, Zachary, and it's the perfect spot to turn to Varun. Varun, as an expert, as someone who thinks about this more than anyone else I know, did you ever expect that here in the United States and in such an advanced progressive city like Austin, Texas, that we would confront the loss of power on the scale that we did for as long as we did in February?
Great. Thank you, Jeremy, for that question. Thank you for having me. And Zach, as always, you continue to blow my mind. That was such a beautiful poem. It captures many, many deep aspects that we hope to tangle a little bit in this discussion. Jeremy, it was quite unprecedented. As a scholar who studies energy, electricity systems all the time, I am very much aware that it's not a perfect system. It's a very, very complex system, and there are disruptions. But the scale and scope of the disruption that we experienced in this crisis was pretty unprecedented. I grew up in India. I was there until the age of 22, and we were, not unused to almost daily power and water disruptions. But in all those years I was there, we never saw something like this. So this one really beats them all.
And what caused it? How do we understand this? Because in India, in my experience, these are often planned disruptions. You're told that every afternoon you'll lose 2 or 3 hours of power. This was nothing on that scale, nothing like that. This was on a much larger scale and, of course, not well planned, right?
That is right. Our system operators certainly did not expect this. What really sparked this, Jeremy, we know it was a very severe weather event, a multi-day deep cold snap that sparked a series of interrelated factors that led to electricity shortages across the state, affecting over 4 million customers. So essentially, a few things happened. About 60% of Texas homes are heated by electricity. And so certainly because of the severe cold, the demand for electricity and electricity-based heating went up, and which meant really that the peak predicted demand was really an all-time high for our electricity system here in Texas. Remember, this is a summer peaking system, and we had very high demands, projected demands. We never reached here because because of the load shedding. So demand was a huge factor, and I'll come back to demand and what could have or should have been done, and certainly something very important to keep an eye in the future. So that was one piece. The second piece was disruption to our gas supply. Gas production as well as supply. So wellheads froze. There are, midstream, there are compressor power losses, which led to, lower pressure in the gas system. And that all meant that, our production was certainly hurt. But that's important because a large part of our power generation here in Texas is based on gas generation. And so if you're not able to supply the gas to those generators, certainly you won't be able to generate the power. And so that is the third piece, which is, generation was hurt. And this was not just in gas, it was across the board. There was a little bit of coal that was hurt. There was a little bit of nuclear that was hurt. Renewable power was hurt. But really the biggest one was on gas-based power generation, accounting for about 75% of the lost capacity. And, as one of the CEOs mentioned at last week's hearings at the Ledge, that quote, biggest gains would have been if we could have kept gas flowing to the plants, unquote. And, in the end math, Jeremy, this was about 100 times in scale than rolling blackouts in California last summer. I'll just give you very quickly, and we'll come back to maybe unpacking some of this. Cost to the system and to individuals, households, is just literally astronomical, something that will become more complex as we see this unpack. So over $50 billion in power bill, widespread water system damage at city municipality, but also at the household level. mental and physical toll. There are COVID-related issues that are just starting to get highlighted. Insurance costs related to houses and other things. Bankruptcies of companies and local governments. Loss of life, which is really the astounding end here, and then much more that we'll see. So multiple interrelated factors led to this, starting with the deep weather event and a huge cost to the system in an absolutely unprecedented scale here, Jeremy.
Is it safe to say, Varun, that one of the causes was the insufficient maintenance and updating of the basic infrastructure, from equipment to the various other elements of this large complex system?
That certainly contributed, Jeremy, but I won't say that was singularly the main reason here, and part of that is because of winterization and equipment maintenance. There was some disruption in power generation itself, but as I mentioned, a lot of that played out because what happened in the gas supply, right? And there are these multiple factors associated. So, for example, one of the things that played out is a lot of the gas operation, both in the fields as well as as you start moving the gas in the pipelines and process them before you send them to the plants, it's dependent on electricity. And as load was being shed, a lot of that power is also getting lost. So you don't have the power to run your gas system, and you need the gas to run your power system. So we saw a lot of this circularity play out. So equipment maintenance, winterization certainly played a role. And if we were much better on that front, that would certainly have helped. But it was not the only factor.
And one more topic that's been in the news, because the governor mentioned this himself, I believe, during the crisis on television. What role did renewables, wind and solar, play in this? You made the point, Varun, that gas is the largest source of power in the system. So what role did renewables play?
All types of power generation, Jeremy, were impacted during this event. This was a massive event, including renewables were hurt. In the month of February, wind and solar, and largely wind, solar is not at the same scale as wind. Wind is really pretty big in Texas. About a quarter of installed capacity in Texas is wind. In the month of February, wind was expected to supply about 10-15% of the demand. So the expectations were not high, just because that's how wind blows. So that was kind of expected. But because of the weather event, wind underperformed even that, right? So, and that led to about 3 to 5 gigawatts of a lower capacity because of wind underperforming. And there are lots of things that happen, including frozen wind turbines and other factors. That said, the peak loss capacity in the system that led to the load shedding was about 35 to 40 gigawatts. And about 30 gigawatts of that was because of gas. So you're talking about a 30 gigawatt disruption in the gas-based system and a 3 to 5 gigawatt disruption in the renewable system. And, that's, anybody can look at that and said, yes, both were contributors, but really the much larger contribution here was because of, the gas-based generation and the gas supply that feeds that generation.
Right. So in other words, if the gas generation had not gone down in the way it did, we would not have had anywhere near the disruption that we had.
Definitely.
So that leads, I think, to the next set of questions, Varun, and I think probably some of the most important ones for us thinking about how we move forward, understanding, first of all, how the state reacted. So how did the state react to this, and to what extent did the state fall victim to circumstances it couldn't control? And to what extent were there opportunities that were missed as this crisis unfolded?
Great. A really very important question for all of us to reflect, Jeremy. Let's begin with what happened during the event itself. So, I think, taking a step back, operationally, right, our utilities, the grid operator, which is ERCOT, and especially frontline workers in power plants and utilities, in water systems, they did a phenomenal job. I mean, we as individuals and households we're struggling to stay warm and, keep our families fed and clean and healthy. And just imagine what these workers were going through and putting themselves, everything that they have out there in such extreme weather to keep the lights on and keep us warm. So I think that's if you ask for one single story that was amazing, that is it. Without those efforts, the crisis could have been much deeper and impacts would have been much worse. I mean, it's already as worse as we have seen here, but it could certainly have been worse. There are also lots of other positive and swift actions, at the state government level. So, for example, reaching out to the federal government, lining up and clearing up things to have FEMA support flow, remove temporary bottlenecks in equipment repairs at homes and businesses, and other things. There are certainly, we saw during the event, quick recognition and movement to make sure that things can move forward and get taken care of during the event and following it. Now, but there are also, I would say 3 pretty big failures even during the event. And, we still have to talk about what could have been done leading to the event. We'll come to that. But during the event, state coordinated disaster response, right? This was a disaster by any measure, and actually one of the big ones, Hurricane Harvey that we experienced a couple of years ago. That was a major disaster, and this is an order of magnitude bigger than that. Could certainly much deeper and statewide. Right, just gives you a sense of scale of what we are talking about here. There was very little of state coordinated disaster response that we actually saw, even during the event. Right, the 3-4 days of the high intensity from February 15th to 18th. Households and communities had to organize quickly and take care of themselves. Really, here, kudos to the local leaders and our nonprofits in the state that really came together quickly and helped each other and helped communities and people. The second is communications. All the communications from different layers of our government were all over and inconsistent in many parts. I mean, it really left our people completely clueless, right? And quickly, I think individuals made the decisions. Hey, we'll have to deal with this on our own and lean on our neighbors and friends and community to take care of this. So that was not very helpful. And the third piece, which is playing out now, and that is where a lot of the system changes, including policies and regulations and market changes, will come from, is really the finger pointing and passing the buck on responsibility that happened even during the crisis, right? It really laid bare some deep gaps that exist in the system in terms of coordination, interaction, responsibility, accountability, and created an ugly situation and very bad name for a state that greatly prouds itself with its energy system.
And what role did structural issues in the grid play? I mean, we've heard a lot about how the Texas grid is separated from the 2 other American grids. Would the crisis have been better without that energy structure in the state?
That's a great question, Zach. It could certainly have been better, right? The advantage of being connected to other systems is when you have difficulties in your system, other systems can basically prop you up, right? I mean, this is, how we also face this as individuals. We have our social networks and, safety nets that, when we go through crisis individually, we reach out to, folks in our network, or folks in our network reach out to us and help us really go through that. And it's no different from that perspective. There are other parts of the, other grids that were also hurt, actually, not at the same level, though, right? Because the market constructs are different, and there is ability to take care of some of these extreme events in different ways than our system. So, I mean, all things equal, could it have helped for us to have been connected? Definitely, it would have helped. The question, though, does it mean that we should go ahead and connect? I mean, that raises all sorts of very, very deep questions as to when and how and if that needs to happen.
And this connects, Varun, to me what is the most difficult puzzle to understand, which is we're a state that's filled with so much talent and expertise and knowledge and experience in this area. The UT Energy Institute is one example of this, but there's no state that has as much energy expertise as Texas. We seem so unprepared for this in all kinds of ways. Why is that?
That's the core of the question, Jeremy. And just as you said, it is, often this is a reminder that often beneath the calm, there can be lots of nuances and fragility, right? And we'll come back to this towards the end of discussion and talk about, what it means. And, in the spirit of your series, this is democracy, what it means to, have great modern systems. And as Zach pointed out in his poem, right, we live in these, extremely complex modern systems, but how to make sense of it and how to stay connected with it. To your question, Jeremy, there are multiple things that play out here and gaps that have, not at this scale, but, the different analysts have been talking about those over the years, not recently only. And now, we see just how interconnected, interdependent, and inadequate those pieces are in taking care of this, the energy system at this scale. So I'll just, highlight a few. So for example, the first one that comes to mind, if you ask me, Jeremy, what is it that we could have done that would have led to a different outcome, not in the long run, but in the very short run, right? And that is the one that, I keep wondering a lot about. And the first thing comes to mind is very short-term planning and weather forecasts and so on. So typically our system operator, ERCOT, and, other actors, so generators and producers, they work with a 10-year horizon, right? ERCOT certainly, that's kind of the time horizon it works on. And, we had a similar experience in 2011, not as intense, but similar. 89 was in some ways, there are some early studies coming out which are saying 89 was perhaps more intense. So, it is an extreme event, right? We don't see this every year or, for that matter, even every 5 or 10 years, but it is not something that we have not seen. This is, not completely out of the back, and this is not once in a century or once in 500 years event. And so that's one thing, right? Why do we not take a long horizon? And that the answer there is obviously we should. Right? So let's keep that aside. Leading to the days and weeks ahead, there was a lot of warning. I individually, I knew it was going to be very bad, right? And many power producers and forecasters already were tracking this, and many of them were communicating to different pieces of the ecosystem, including the operator and the regulators as well as policymakers. And the biggest failure, in my view, leading up to the event was not doing more by our operators and regulators during the event, just a few days or week ahead of the event, even though it was not a complete surprise. It didn't happen overnight. We knew. And so, just how, so for example, what could have been done? Well, we knew we were going to face issues on the supply side, right? And a lot of that is factored already into projections. Yet, if you sense that it is going to get very ugly and uglier than what may have been planned a few months ago, right? The reports for the next season get done a few months ahead just so that, you have some time to plan. But days and weeks ahead, the indications were that this was going to perhaps get much worse. And if that is the case, obviously you reach out to demand side, right? Which is, something you typically don't plan for. But, you prepare people, you communicate, you say, hey, we really need to come together. And there are lots of other things that could actually be done. But if you do that proactively, it could have been a much more managed, real, rolling blackouts, not the kind of, mass multi-day deep blackouts. So, planning, forecasting, how we communicate and manage demand, even in the very, very short run, is one factor. Oversight, we talked about. Winterization of equipment, but then also, what the expectations are for reliability. How is that defined, right? Currently, in the power system, much of our reliability is just left to the energy-only construct that we have. It works pretty well in a lot of the time, but just as we saw right now, there are certainly gaps. So we are going to see a lot of discussion around what do we mean by reliability, what are our expectations, and is our current market construct for how our electricity system and its interconnection to other parts of the energy system operate, is that adequate? And the answer will be there are gaps and we need to plug those. I already mentioned coordination across agencies and across levels of government. We really saw how that was very inadequate, and there's a lot more that needs to be done. And then, the last one I mentioned is basically the market features of our market, right? We saw many discrepancies come in the market design, including very high prices, both in power and gas, right? So our system hit the maximum cap that is allowed, that is, $9,000 per megawatt hour. And typically that is for a long time. It is expected to last a few hours in a year at different times, not all at the same time. But, this lasted for, many, many hours, right? A couple days straight and more, all at once. And that's not how this is supposed to work. Likewise, on the gas side, normally gas has been very cheap for the last several years. Just before the event, it was trading at $2-3 per unit, and it went up to $200, so over 100 times during the event, right? And that's and so what's going on there? Customers are exposed to different types of these prices, both on the power and the gas side, and these are not the same problems. And then finally, what role does market power of some of the firms who are able to operate, as well as potential price gouging I just mentioned? Prices went very high up. But this is a complex question, right? Scarcity, prices are allowed to go up because, if there's scarcity, prices should go up, and, that helps you allocate resources better. And at the same time, because if there's a lot of scarcity, that means, some actors might have more market power, and it could lead to price gouging. It is a very tough, complex question to separate. And it will be months and years before we know anything. And then putting all of this together, Jeremy, I think, it points us to what do we need to change in policies? I will come to that. But essentially, really two things: very clearly defining what the reliability expectations are, and putting in place sets of policies which takes the interconnected nature of this system, this electricity, gas, and other sources, interconnectedness, dependencies. Putting a holistic look at that is that's the one single thing that has come out of this.
Varun, just following up on these very insightful comments, do you think that in the balancing that's required in any energy system, and really any system of any kind, the balancing between market and government regulation, have we gone too far in the market direction? And is that part of the cause here?
That's a very profound question, Jeremy. Markets are great. They really allow efficient allocation of resources. It allows, because of the competition it is able to generate. There are lots of great things that come out of it. The one thing to keep in mind is that in markets as complex and as interdependent as we have in Texas and in other parts of the world, markets are part of it. And there's lots of, and markets are creations of policies. And when you have this type of supply and demand and pricing mechanism, there are also all sorts of constraints that go together with it. So it is not as if, hey, here is some demand and here is some supply, just go figure it out. There are lots of other things that are going on. And when that happens, it's important to keep in mind that the layered complexities can make it very difficult to anticipate and address extreme events like what we saw a few days ago. And what we have learned, and this is not a surprise, we have known this, that just leaving it all for, again, layered complex market systems to figure it out, extreme events are harder to address using that. So there certainly need to be thought and work in terms of understanding and designing corner solutions that can take care of these extreme events. But I'll fall short of saying, hey, we went too far. There are other gaps, and there are not just gaps in the market design, but there are other gaps that did exist. And at the same time, it was not as if it's purely based on price and demand and supply. There are all sorts of other complexities that are layered on top of it.
Absolutely. And this is one of the themes of our podcast each week, of course, which is that our world has become very complex, and our understanding and application of democratic principles has to change in that. It's not enough to understand how one thought of democracy in the 18th century. One has to update our thinking for this complexity that you articulated so eloquently. I think this takes us really to where we always like to close, which is, what have we learned? And what can we do differently? And I wonder if it might be worth focusing for a second on the question of government policy reform, institutional reform. What are the things that we as a state and that as a larger democracy we should be thinking about? What kind of institutions did we not have that maybe we should consider building right now?
Thank you, Jeremy. And many of these came up already, and so I'll highlight a few again here. The interconnected and fragility of our systems. I mean, these are highly complex systems, and they need constant vigilance at all levels. You can't step aside and hope it exists, because, hey, these systems exist within natural systems, right? They're constantly being, bombarded, if you will, by, all kinds of unexpected and rare events, which are increasing in frequency, right? And, again, we have to keep in mind that we are a summer peaking system. Typically, we encounter in our ERCOT grid in Texas, typically our issues are in summer. And we know for sure, summer events are going to get more and more extreme. And we have struggled almost every single year the last several years. We have been on the edge, on our toes every year. Say, hey, do we have enough resources to meet? And now we are seeing really the ugliness of it play out in a winter. And that just tells you, that here in this system, we are going to be dealing with both ends of it. It raises all sorts of very important and challenging technology, engineering, and design questions. It's a topic for detailed discussion some other time. But that's something that certainly is very relevant in terms of lessons learned. Planning and preparation ahead of time. I already alluded to that. Prediction and precaution. At different time scales, right? Not just years and months ahead, but also in leading days into it, right? In knowing, what this has told us, that things can go wrong and layer onto each other very quickly. And so every single part of the system needs to be mobilized. And what was least mobilized, and it will keep everybody wondering and shaking their heads, could we just only if we had banked more on demand or tried to bring demand more into the picture, days off. No, I'm not talking longer term. So, for customers, it's very hard to engage customers, behavior change and messaging, communication, coordination, right? Individuals like, hey, everybody else can cut, and, why should I? But in events like this, there are ways to manage that. There are ways to communicate that. There are ways to leverage that community feel, which you wouldn't be able to do, normally in regular constructs. We already talked about market design. There are great features to it, yet extreme events like this require us to pay different types of attention, bring different types of constructs and potentially solutions to that. And if that is what it takes to get the level of reliability that this community, our society expects, then so be it. That's primal. It's not, it can't be ideology of we must have a completely regulated, or we must have a completely deregulated. That's not where we start. We start at what is it that we want and expect from in terms of reliability and quality of service, and then what it takes to get there. And then finally, the resilience and fortitude of our households and communities. We learn, Jeremy, that, we as households are resilient, and we as individuals and neighbors are connected, and we care about our communities. And Zach's poem really brings that to the fore in terms of how events like this really make us go back and identify and connect back to our nature, to our existence, and bring everything we have within ourselves to get through this ourselves. But also it's a great reminder that we are survivors, but then also we also care not just ourselves, but also about our communities.
That's so well said, and it's another theme that we highlight every week, and you've highlighted it so beautifully, Varun, which is that democracy is about freedom, but it's also about the management of different interests and the balancing of different needs and the role of government in sometimes limiting some elements of freedom for the larger experience and enjoyment of freedom by a larger number. Zachary, do you and your generation of intelligent emerging citizens, how has this event affected you? Gave us some insights into that in your poem. I think it would be helpful to close with the learning that's occurred and the inspiration, perhaps, for your generation from hearing Varun and understanding these issues.
Yeah, I think that we're in a very interesting period. I think that a lot of young people right now are really seeing how these systems that have been in place since before our grandparents really came into the world, how those systems are really not permanent and how they can so easily change and how dependent they are on outside factors. And on the one hand, that's very scary. It shows us how vulnerable our society is, but it's also very hopeful because there's a lot of space to change these systems and to make them more resilient and to innovate. And I think young people today are not going to take these old traditional systems for granted. I think we're really going to bring a different perspective to these issues.
Right. I think you've learned that the power dish doesn't magically emerge in your house. It doesn't just magically get there. Varun, I think like Zachary and like me and like many of our listeners, you're an optimist. It's one of the reasons I love being your colleague and friend. Just to close, what are you most optimistic about right now?
I'm optimistic that we will learn from this deep crisis. As communities, we have to take this experience and come out of this in terms of designing our systems better. Going back to what Zach said, it is something that we all forget is it. I mean, our utilities, our workers, people who take care of this system, it is a very difficult and important job. It's a great reminder of the complexity, but also of the commitment. It is required at all single moments, every single time, and we take it for granted. And it's a great reminder that what it takes to do that. So for us to both understand and engage more, and that is the one thing that I really hope Jeremi comes out of this is, as individuals, households, families, neighbors, as communities, that we take the time and thought to understand and engage better in the system, and we don't slide back into the comfort, right? And we will not. And keeping engaged with our decision makers, with our policymakers, having our voices heard. This series, This is Democracy, is a recognition of how important and how the foundational bedrock of everything is how individuals connecting and engaging with the system. And I think this is deep enough that this will lead to some fundamental realignment and rethinking and re-engagement, if you will, which certainly is, given the comfort and luxury we all have all the time, it works most of the time. So I think that is what I really hope. Our level of engagement and commitment and a collective responsibility in taking this to a better place.
It's such a vital point and the perfect point to close on, Varun. Many people who write about democracy across different time periods have made the point that democracies are susceptible to crises, and they are susceptible to catastrophe because it's such a complex system. It's much more complex than an authoritarian system would be, where you have one person in charge. But democracies also have historically an extraordinary capacity to learn, and they learn for just the reasons that you described and that you model, Varun, which is the clear-headed and really focused analysis of the events and taking from those events lessons to adjust, reform, experiment, and not stay in the same place one was before. And I think this is such an exciting moment, stressful, but also exciting moment for institutional reform. And it's, of course, what you and I and so many scholars think about, and it's what's so exciting, I think, for so many citizens right now to think about how we can reform and improve our democracy. And energy is I think, one of the most important areas. Varun, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us, sharing your experiences. I hope our listeners will pay attention to your work, and in particular to the work of the UT Energy Institute, which is easy to find on the web and always has exciting and interesting events. Thank you for joining us, Varun.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Thank you so much, Zach. Your poem was very inspiring, and I really enjoyed the discussion. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. And yes, thank you to Zachary for his insightful poem, as always. And thank you most of all to our listeners for joining us for this week of This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts ITS Development Studio
and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harris Codini. Stay tuned for a new episode every week. You can find This is Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher.
See you next time.